Both President Biden and former President Trump have warned against World War III. In fact, every U.S. president has in the nuclear age. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government at dailytorch.com. Today, we're going to be talking about, unfortunately, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is getting incredibly dangerous. And President Donald Trump is warning the American people. He's at a campaign spot here in South Carolina. Trump in South Carolina warns, quote, Joe Biden has brought us to the brink of World War III as U.S. and NATO send tanks to Ukraine. Now, this is kind of just, it's not even an alarmist headline. In fact, every single U.S. president has warned against World War III since the beginning of the Cold War as something to be definitely avoided. And it's pretty very much in the tradition of presidents. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to hear from each of these presidents, both Trump and Biden, pretty much agreeing on this point, which, again, every president since Truman has very much agreed upon. Here was Trump in South Carolina.
It never happened. If I was president, there would not have been a war with Russia in Ukraine, zero chance, and Lindsey would be happy with that. That's better than any alternative. Wouldn't have happened. And I will say this, even now, despite tremendous loss of lives and destruction of much of that country, I would have a peace deal negotiated within 24 hours. You could make a peace deal, you could make a deal for both right now, 24 hours.
There you go. Trump says he could get this thing solved in 24 hours and avoid war. That's pretty bold. But on the other hand, there was no war in Ukraine to this extent. The war began in 2014 when the Yanukovych administration in Ukraine was overthrown. There was basically they pushed him out of office by force. People were, rioting in the capital. He had to flee to Russia. And then a pro-Western president got in there. So you had a pro-Russian president. He gets overthrown. And then there's a pro-Western president that comes in. And we've supported those administrations since then. But in terms of the question of World War III, President Biden has similarly, tried to, I think, avoid this. He's been warning against this. He talks about the sacred obligation of defending every inch of NATO. And I wanted you to hear it because you'll see that they're actually agreeing on this question.
Ukraine, we're going to continue to stand together with our allies in Europe and send unmistakable message that we will defend every inch of NATO territory, every single inch, with a united, galvanized NATO. One movement. That's why I moved over 12,000 American forces along the borders with Russia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Romania, etc. Because they move once. Granted, if we respond, it is World War III, but we have a sacred obligation on NATO territory, a sacred obligation, Article 5. And we will not, although we will not fight the Third World War in Ukraine. Putin's war against Ukraine was never be a victory. Democrats are rising to meet the moment, rallying the world on the side of peace and security. We're showing a strength and we'll never falter. But look, the idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks and trains going in with American pilots and American crews, just understand, and don't kid yourself, no matter what you all say, that's called World War III. Okay?
Okay, there's Biden. He's saying offensive equipment, tanks, planes, troops, stuff like that, where we're going into theater. That would mean World War III. That's an escalation because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Poland is, Germany is, Britain is, France is, Italy, etc. An attack on one is an attack on all under the NATO treaty. Now, Ukraine has applied for NATO accession, but even Biden's national security advisor has previously ruled this out last September after Ukraine made the request, which is to say that, maybe later, like we got to deal with this later, implying after the war. We're not going to put Ukraine in NATO right now because Russia has already invaded Ukraine. That would automatically trigger the NATO treaty, and you really would have World War III. But you fast forward several months now, and we seem to be sliding closer to this, we're going beyond the point of no return he had articulated here, because now we're sending Abrams tanks to Ukraine, according to Biden. This was on January 25th, just a few days ago. Take a listen.
Armored capability, as General Austin will tell you, has been critical. And that's why the United States has committed hundreds of armored fighting vehicles to date, including more than 500 as part of the assistance package we announced last Friday. And today I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion. Secretary Austin has recommended this step because it will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives. The Abrams tanks are the most capable tanks in the world. They're also extremely complex to operate and maintain. So we're also giving Ukraine the parts and equipment necessary to effectively sustain these tanks on the battlefield. And we'll begin to train the Ukrainian troops on these issues of sustainment, logistics, and maintenance as soon as possible. Delivering these tanks to the field is going to take time. That we'll use to make sure the Ukrainians are fully prepared to integrate the Abrams tanks into their defenses. We're also closely coordinated this announcement with our allies. The American contribution will be joined by an additional announcement, including that will be ready, available, and more easily integrated for use in the battlefield in the coming weeks and months from other countries. I'm grateful to Chancellor Scholz for providing German Leopard 2 tanks, and will lead an effort to organize a European contribution of 2 tank battalions for Ukraine. I want to thank the Chancellor for his leadership and his steadfast commitment to our collective efforts to support Ukraine.
So there we are. Germany sending Leopard 2 tanks. We're sending Abrams tanks. Biden says these are the best tanks in the world. I believe it. U.S. military is second to none. And the equipment that they use is going to be, practically speaking, second to none. But here he is on January 25th, 2023, saying we're sending tanks. But when you go back just a year ago, back in 2022, he's talking to members of Congress here. This is Joe Biden addresses the Democrat caucus in Philadelphia, March 11, 2022. Why is it important that Biden communicate with Democratic leaders and members of Congress in 2022? Yes, it's a campaign event. Yes, but they want to know about the war. Are we getting involved? What is the Article 1 commitment? Well, under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war. But Congress also has the power to appropriate funds. And so you have the $1.7 trillion omnibus bill. You also have other legislation that passes every year called the National Defense Authorization Act. These act as basically blank checks for the Pentagon and for the White House. In this case, did Congress authorize Biden to send Abrams tanks to Ukraine? Technically speaking, with these blank checks, yeah, he could have sent them 6 months ago if he had wanted to, because that's how broad and expansive these authorizations are. And it also shows how little Congress wants to have to do with congressional authorizations. If you really have to go back to 2002, the last time we had a congressional authorization to use military force in Iraq. Before that, 2001, authorization to use military force in Afghanistan. Before that, you have to go back to, I think, 1990, the 1990s and the Persian Gulf War, where there was a similar authorization. And so Congress would rather not take that position. And it seems like Biden would rather not go to a war either. So they're doing everything up to the point of going to war to support and defend Ukraine without actually sticking them in NATO and really getting you to World War III. But if Biden is willing to go back on his word about sending tanks today, well, what about the other things he mentioned in March? He mentioned planes, he mentioned troops, and he mentioned offensive equipment. Well, the offensive equipment's been there ever since Congress started spending hundreds of billions of dollars on the war in Ukraine. Now they're sending the tanks. So the other two would be the planes, say F-16s or something, and then finally troops. Now, a year ago, before the invasion, on January 25th, 2022, This is, just days before Russia's about to invade Ukraine. Biden's warning this is an imminent danger, that Russia is about to invade. I was actually skeptical of this because, the civil war in Ukraine has been going on since 2014. After Yanukovych was overthrown, and then Russia annexed Crimea. And so it's like, oh, why didn't they invade in 2014 or 2015 and 16, 17, 18, 19, 20? And Trump is saying in his speech, it's because I was there. Trump saying I was in office. I was a deterrent. Maybe he threatened to nuke Moscow or something if anything happened in Ukraine. And maybe Trump thinks that Biden's weak, and that's why Ukraine got invaded. Or maybe Ukraine would have gotten invaded all the same, and then Trump would be facing the same situation. We really don't know, to counterfactual. But here was Biden a year ago, January 25th, articulating what the extent of U.S. involvement in Ukraine would and would not entail. Take a listen.
We have no intention of putting American forces or NATO forces in Ukraine.
So that's one. We have no intention of putting American forces or NATO forces in Ukraine. And same gaggle of reporters here. Here he is again.
You guys, let's go. Thank you, guys. You guys, come on, let's go. Thank you.
There is not going to be any American forces moving into Ukraine.
So there you go. There not going to be any American forces moving into Ukraine. The reporter was asking, well, there can't just be economic consequences. What about military consequences? And Biden again says, we are not sending forces to Ukraine. And he told us in March of 2022, because that would mean World War III. That would be a nuclear exchange. So we haven't been in such a dangerous situation, I think, since 1982, I believe is the year here. I wanted to give you some history here on what has happened over the years as we can get past this, current Russian invasion, these warnings of World War III. You have to go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. But after that, when 1983, there was also a near accidental nuclear war that almost occurred when the Soviet Union's early warning system erroneously reported that the U.S. had launched a single warhead at Russia. It turned out it was a false alarm. It was never acted upon. And thank goodness, the Soviet operator who was, monitoring the early warning system judged, and he didn't report it up the command chain of command there, because he determined that if there was going to be a nuclear strike, there would be multiple warheads. You wouldn't just fire one warhead. So he determined that it was an error in their early warning system, and it turned out to be true. We never launched a warhead at the Soviet Union in 1983 because maybe we wouldn't even be here right now. But before that, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you have to go. There's been a few times during the Cold War where this has happened. But if you look at the entire history of the Cold War, and all U.S. presidents have had, declarative statements against World War III with unanimity. Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. They've all spoken out against this, and they frequently invoke the term Armageddon. And I wanted to go through some of these instances. You start with Truman. He was the first one to use atomic weapons, the only president to use atomic weapons, nuclear weapons in theater, in the war, to end World War II. And he said in 1949, this is low-key statements by presidents. That of Truman after the Soviets first tested their weapon. This is actually 1949. Ever since atomic energy was first released by man, the eventual development of this new force by other nations was to be expected. This probability has always been taken into account by us. No single nation could, in fact, have a monopoly of atomic weapons, thanks to the Rosenbergs. This recent development, I inserted that myself, by the way, this recent development emphasizes once again, if indeed such emphasis were needed, the necessity for that truly effective and forcible international control of atomic energy. With this government and the large majority of members of the United Nations support. He was acknowledging the inevitability of basically mutually assured destruction, that these weapons were going to get out there, whether it was stolen from us by the Soviets or not, just because technical ingenuity and scientific advances were getting to the point where nuclear power was going to be proliferated throughout the world. And once you get the nuclear power, you can use the nuclear fuel to create the nuclear weapons, which is what exactly has happened. Even as it gets beyond the Soviet Union, in his farewell address in 1953, this was what I wanted to reference earlier: starting an atomic war, this is Harry Truman, is totally unthinkable for rational men. There's a statement against World War III. Dwight Eisenhower called for a turn away from militarization and introduced what he called the, quote, language of atomic warfare. He says, I feel impelled to speak today in a language that, in a sense, is new, one which I, who have spent so much of my life in the military profession, would have preferred never to use. That new language is the language of atomic warfare. In this quest, I know that we must not lack patience. I know that in a world divided such as ours today, salvation cannot be obtained by one dramatic act. I know that many steps will have been to be taken over many months before the world can look at itself one day and truly realize that a new climate of mutually peaceful confidence is abroad in the world. But I know above all else that we must start to take these steps now. The United States would seek more than a mere reduction or elimination of atomic materials for military purposes. It is not enough to take the weapon out of the hands of the soldiers. It must be put into the hands of those who know how to strip its military casing and adapt it to the arts of peace. The United States knows that if the fearful trend of atomic military buildup can be reversed, the greatest destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind. This is a statement against World War III as well. In 1960, then Vice President Nixon, he would go on to sign the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaties in 1972. When he was on the campaign trail against Kennedy, he described the careful language that Eisenhower had used. So Eisenhower's talking, we have to speak in the language of atomic warfare. And so here is Nixon further articulating this principle. He spoke of winning the Cold War with, quote, without war. Quote, I am convinced that we do have the strength and will develop more to win this struggle and to win it without war. It is going to take leadership. It is going to take leadership which will be calm in the time of crisis, leadership which will be firm, but leadership which will not be belligerent, because we must never indulge in the war of words, which might heat up the international atmosphere to the point that a nuclear catastrophe would come to the whole world. These are statements all through the heart of the Cold War. Presidents and presidential candidates, they speak this way. In 1983, Reagan in an interview stated that a nuclear war must never occur. He stated, quote, there must not be a nuclear war, then maybe the people will understand why we're trying so desperately to get a reduction in those weapons worldwide. And I hope if we start down the reduction road that the other side will see the common sense in eliminating them totally. So Ronald Reagan, he, on this issue, I think was one of the most radical presidents in a good sense. He wanted to get all of the nuclear weapons gone everywhere, just get rid of them all, because of this problem that we continue to face with successive administrations, both here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., and in Moscow, Russia. We just have to keep on having this conversation because both sides still have thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at one another. But here, I don't you want to, kind of, give my opinion too much. This is the opinion of every single president since Harry Truman about this issue. In 1984, in a debate with Walter Mondale, Reagan declared famously, quote, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So this is the war without a war. It's an approach adopted by presidents going forward, from Truman all the way through Trump, begun by Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. They pulled missiles out of Turkey and Cuba. You've had, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a trajectory for de-escalation, not disarmament, but just reductions and limitations on the export and proliferation of nuclear weapons. And these treaties, SALT I, SALT II under Ford and Carter, that was capitalized on by Reagan and Gorbachev with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, and by both George H.W. Bush and Barack Obama, who signed the Strategic Arms Reductions Treaties. The first one was Bush. Reagan actually started negotiating the START treaty, but it wasn't completed until 1991, and then it was re-upped again in 2010. Of those, the INF treaty by Reagan and Gorbachev, those were terminated. That one was terminated. The INF treaty was terminated by Trump. The ABM treaty, we mentioned that earlier, that was eliminated by George W. Bush. Both presidents had unilaterally pulled out of those treaties. And so that's kind of the, the Biden too, he has warned of potential consequences. This was an October 6th fundraiser in the campaign during the midterm elections. He said, quote, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've got a guy I know fairly well. His name is Vladimir Putin. I spend a fair amount of time with him. He is not joking when he talks about the use of tactical and nuclear weapons. So he has a preference for, he looks for off ramps. He very clearly is talking in this speech also referenced an off ramp, indicating a desire for de-escalation by Washington, D.C., stating, quote, "We're trying to figure out what is Putin's off ramp? Where does he get off? Where does he find a way out?" So even here, Biden is communicating with Putin, not unlike other presidents, in a way that can, broadcast to the world. He's speaking to the American people, but he's also speaking to Moscow. There's more than one audience when a president is speaking about nuclear war. Most oftentimes when a president is referencing nuclear Armageddon, World War III, he's talking about Russia. He may also be talking about China, could be talking about Iran. I mean, there's many nuclear actors that you want to keep your eye on if you're the United States, if you're NATO, you're Australia, et cetera. You want to keep an eye on these things. But here we're talking about Russia yet again. And so to the extent that such denuclearization agreements and arrangements have been achieved at all, it was through reciprocal negotiations that led to occasional breakthroughs, miraculous breakthroughs, when you consider what Reagan and Gorbachev were able to pull off in the 1980s. That's the best example. But, you have to really give credit to Nixon, frankly, for starting with the SALT Treaty and the ABM Treaty. That's what got you from here to there. Does the Cold War end without the strategic arms reductions? Would have Gorbachev, could he have, would the Soviet Union have fallen apart if everyone in the Soviet Union was fearful of nuclear war? Whereas by the late 1980s, people were less fearful of nuclear war. And that was one of the catalysts. There were economic causes, there were the sanctions, there was everything we were doing to try to defeat the Soviet Union. But you will recall that our intelligence agencies didn't see the Soviet Union falling. That was an intelligence failure. Nobody was predicting, except for Ronald Reagan, that the Soviet Union would fall apart. That was his goal. That was his stated mission. He said, "We're going to defeat you." And he told, Gorbachev to tear down the wall. But it was because of these, I think, accommodations that were made on both sides to avoid World War III that made it so that Gorbachev felt okay with standing back when the Soviet Union was falling apart. He kept the army in the barracks. He did not put down what was actually a peaceful kind of transition to a different form of government. We thought it might be democratic, but then we got Putin, and it's not democratic. So here's the closing. In October, Biden mentioned off ramps, meaning there must be the possibility of a negotiated settlement. And given the alternatives that he has already articulated, which seem too terrible to fully contemplate, and his opponent in the elections sharing that assessment, when both the president and the former president are saying we're on the brink of World War III, maybe it's time to start talking. Now, I know I went on long there, but I wanted to get to the chat. We'll go back to the beginning here. I'm sure you're complaining about the audio. Here we go. Let's see here. We have Charlotte Ava. I am even scared. Yeah. Let's see here. Peggy White, the government at work, rocket scientists. Ha ha ha. And that's probably a comment about our audio. Term limits now. I'm not sure that would prevent World War III. Let's see here. Charlotte Ava. Looking through your post and having some interest in the post. Think we might have something in common. Let's see. Look at these before we go up. I'll hide that one. Oh, good. Okay, now there's the audio. All right. Here is Karen Mitchell. You are our president, Donald Trump. You never lost. They're dragging this out intentionally. Brett Schellner. Here's Nettie Stallings. Can't believe a word Biden says. He is such a liar. Well, see, I'm hoping to get past kind of the partisan context here, as the title of the video entails. Every single president has issued this warning about World War III, and so there's a saying in Washington and in America, the politics ends at the water's edge. And what I wanted to kind of share with you here is that presidents, regardless of their political party, they are the commander in chief. They have to be the steward of our nuclear deterrent. And Theodore Roosevelt used to put it, to speak softly but carry a big stick. Almost anticipating, peace through strength. That's Reagan's, kind of call to peaceful arms. That it's actually a Roman kind of theory of protection, which is that by having expanded security, you're so strong nobody wants to fight you, and therefore you get peace. So kind of the Pax Romana there. So these are kind of ancient concepts, antiquarian concepts, but it's kind of real politic, and just how countries and republics, empires, monarchies, etc. That this is how they all survive, is by having a pretty big military, one that cannot be defeated, and therefore nobody dares to try. That's what nuclear weapons represent. Unfortunately, all you would need is a suicidal madman to change that calculus. And so we hope that we don't have madmen for leaders, because if we did, we'd be dead already. I mean, that's the truth of it. So we are depending upon the goodwill of man and of men to keep us out of the jaws of death here, and it's very, very it's unsettling. It's hard to think about, but you get one president at a time. And the truth is, every single one of them has managed so far, except for Truman. He dropped 2 nuclear bombs, but that was a different calculation. They were trying to save American lives. How do we end this war quickly? But the consequences of the nuclear invention has been that they have proliferated throughout the world, and now those missiles are pointed at us as well. And they have been for several decades. And so regardless of who the president is, they have to keep us safe. And we have to pray for their success. So I would just ask you all to pray, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that we get out of this mess, because every other president has gotten us out of this mess. And Joe Biden needs to get us out of this mess. And, Trump's running for president again. If he gets elected, he'll have to keep us out of this mess. Ron DeSantis might be running. If he wins, he would have to keep us out of this mess. And I bet you every single one of them is going to issue a statement against World War III at some point, either during their time running for office or while they're in office, because that's what every president has done. That is U.S. policy. It's not a partisan policy. It's not a partisan issue. Although you might have a preference for political parties, that's absolutely legitimate. If you're interested in voting, obviously vote in vote in your party's primaries, participate in that process. And obviously don't vote for madmen, because we don't need anyone to ever get their hands on this technology that would not use it for the peaceful ends that Eisenhower articulated, but for other ends. And so we always must be great stewards of this awesome responsibility. They call the U.S. and the USSR, Russia, superpowers, because of this reality of nuclear terror that it can, seemingly within minutes, start any minute. It could start any minute. And that's the terror we've been living under for decades. I feel like after the Cold War, after the Soviet Union fell, that people kind of let their guard down about this ever-present danger. We did do another START treaty in 2010. So I think that was important. I think other presidents, people look at the START treaties, the SALT treaties, guys like John Bolton, he's running for president too. He calls them sacred scrolls. John Bolton had no respect for, I think, those treaties, because he thought they were useless, that they were just, kind of paper. But the destruction and limitations of nuclear arms under the START treaties has been real enough. Both sides have been lowering their nuclear stockpiles. Personally, I've always agreed with Reagan on this, that this is a very dangerous thing. And it's kind of Murphy's Law, kind of whatever can go wrong eventually will go wrong. When it comes to nuclear weapons, I hope that that's not proven to be true. I hope that the fear of this, of this reality is to such a degree that every leader in the world, the US, Russia, China, everywhere, that they always have this unanimous agreement that we will never go to nuclear war. But it raises the question then, why are the weapons still stockpiled? It probably, I mean, it seems likely that eventually someone's going to try to use one. Jordan Peterson was just warning that he thinks that tactical nukes will be used within 6 months. People are predicting World War III. Donald Trump is saying we're on the brink of World War III. Joe Biden just in March was saying that, oh yeah, if we start sending tanks to Ukraine, that might mean World War III. And here we are a year later, sending tanks to Ukraine. And, thankfully it hasn't meant World War III yet. It's not about trying to predict the end of the world. It's about trying to prevent it, I think. Here's a long one here. Let's see what we got here. Biden is whole administration are nothing but lighters. I want to be productive, guys. Everyone wants to just say smash Biden. It's like, okay, yeah. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. I didn't vote for Joe Biden. That's not the point. And so, is he lying? Is he lying about sending the troops in? Are the troops there already? I missed that memo. They're on the borders, in the NATO countries. That's where they should be under these circumstances. We have to guard NATO, because if you let your guard down, peace through strength. Trump's position is that if you have peace through strength, you can avoid these conflicts. And so Biden, you have to kind of agree with the position of moving the forces up to the edge. Now, sending the tanks in when he said he previously wouldn't, what will the tit for tat be from Moscow in response to the tanks? Or is that our tit for tat? Russia did something they previously articulated they wouldn't do, and so we're responding by sending in the tanks. Either way, it's escalation. But I think you kind of get the point here. Let's see. Going back to the chat here, Jenny Gargas Maxwell, why doesn't Ukraine have their own weapons? They have their own military. Why not weapons? They do have their own weapons, but we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars. Congress is determined to, I think, fight this war. Frankly, I think that a lot of what was done against Trump in 2016, when the FBI launched a counterintelligence investigation against Trump, was precisely because he was speaking of reaching, if not accommodation, just having talks. The idea that he would eventually go to Helsinki to meet with Putin. He wanted to meet with Putin to discuss these issues because he believed in peace through strength, and he thought that that was the way to keep America safe, to keep the world safe, and to keep us, frankly, out of Armageddon. And so we have to be strong regardless of who is the president. This is BS, says Sherry Jean Salmonson. No, this is not BS. This is every single president's position since the beginning of the Cold War. I want you to know this because you should. We're here to educate you. I mean, not everything's going to be a partisan thing because, frankly, we're a nonpartisan organization, and we have to look at policies. And so, regardless of who the president is, or where are we going to be on taxes or spending or regulations? We want to have a consistent position as Americans for limited government, so that way we can hold elected officials accountable not only to their promises but to principles that we believe in terms of the Constitution. Article 1, where the heck is Congress? When are they going to start exercising restraint upon President Biden? Did they explicitly authorize tanks to go to Ukraine? No, they didn't. They wrote a blank check to Biden, but they do that every year. This National Defense Authorization Act, these omnibus spending bills that we've been signing, they give blanket authorities to the president and to the Pentagon to do just this sort of thing and to move these assets around the world. And now it's done in consultation with leaders of Congress. So Kevin McCarthy, he's the speaker now. He'll have a seat at the table. Chuck Schumer, leader of the Senate, he'll have a seat at the table. Biden should be consulting with Schumer. He should be consulting with McCarthy. And a president, regardless of their party, should be consulting with Congress, regardless of the party, because that's what the Constitution says. So the Constitution is the most important, I think, article that we hold dear in this country, because it's the paper that protects us. It protects our liberty. If Congress didn't have to vote to declare war, well, then presidents could just take us into any war they wanted to anytime. When Obama wanted to go into Syria and he drew a red line, we Americans for Limited Government was asking questions. Where's the authorization to do this? When Trump went into Syria to destroy ISIS, I asked the same question. I was writing articles. Where is the authorization to do that? Now, he leaned on the Iraq authorization. I suppose Obama could have leaned on the Iraq authorization as well. You can say that Nixon was leaning on the Vietnam authorization when he went into Cambodia and so forth. But usually you have a kind of country rule when it comes to authorizations. So if there's no authorization to use military force in Ukraine, then we shouldn't be using force and military force in Ukraine to fight World War III, because Congress hasn't voted to do so. Now, the harsh reality, of course, is that in the event that there was a nuclear emergency or somebody's launching missiles, there probably wouldn't even be time to convene a roll call to vote on such a thing. And that's why the National Defense Authorization Act and the omnibus and these other standing authorizations have put into place the way they are, because those authorizations are active. The president, he can launch any minute. He'll probably give the Congress a call, maybe call the speaker, maybe call the majority leader and say, hey, we've got a big problem. We have a few minutes to react right now. And that would be the situation. And it would be very sad and it would be very tragic, because we hope it never, ever, ever comes to that, which is why, presidents have to exercise restraint, but so does Congress. Congress authorizes a lot of these operations that are going on in Ukraine, or special forces. Like, are there special forces in Ukraine? Who the heck knows? But if they were, they would be authorized in many, many ways by Congress. And so these Senate and House Intelligence Committees, they're read into all of this. And that's another method of feedback for Congress to talk to the president, regardless of which party they're in, to prevent such a horrible, catastrophic outcome that I think we all fear. So that's pretty much my thoughts on all of this. You don't have to agree with me. You can just kind of hate on Biden. I think that's, serves a political purpose, I suppose. But, when there's a Republican president again, you'll want to hold him accountable too, for just these same reasons. Again, if both the president, who's a Democrat, and the former president, who's a Republican, are saying we're on the brink of World War III, maybe it's time to start talking, start negotiations, start diplomacy. That's what every other president has done before this one. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.